Usapay kadar on the tabaka.
Fatherland videos. Tonight we have a folktale from the Philippines. Tonight's folktale read is coming from the book Philippine Folktales. General Editor Jake Jackson. Introduction by Gabriella Lee. We're here on page 150. The story of Zaragoza. Years and years ago, there lived in a village a poor couple, Louise and Maria. Louise was lazy and selfish, while Maria was hardworking and dutiful. 3 children had been born to this pair, but none had lived long enough to be baptized. The wife was once more about to be blessed with a child, and Louise made up his mind what he should do to save its life. Soon the day came when Maria bore her second son. Louise, feeling that this child, like the others, would die, unchristian, decided to have it baptized the very next morning. Maria was very glad to know of her husband's determination, for she believed that the early deaths of the other children were probably due to the delay in baptizing them. The next morning, Louise, with the infant in his arms, hastened to the church. But in his haste, he forgot to ask his wife who should stand as godfather As he was considering this oversight, a strange man passed by, whom he asked, "Will you be so kind as to act as my child's godfather?" "With all my heart," was the stranger's reply. They then entered the church, and the child was named Luis, after his father. When the services were over, Luis entreated Zaragoza, such was the name of the godfather, to dine at his house. As Zaragoza had just arrived in the village for the first time, he was but too ready to accept the invitation. Now, Zaragoza was a kind-hearted man and soon won the confidence of his hosts and hostesses, who invited him to remain with them for several days. Luis and Zaragoza became close friends and often consulted each other on the matters of importance. One evening, as the two friends were conversing, their talk turned upon the affairs of the kingdom. Luis told his friend how the king oppressed the people by levying heavy taxes on all sorts of property, and for that reason was very rich. Zaragoza, moved by the news, decided to avenge the wrongs of the people. Luis hesitated, for he could think of no sure means of punishing the tyrannical monarch. Then Zaragoza suggested that they should try to steal the king's treasure, which was hidden in the cellar of the palace. Luis was much pleased with the project, for he thought that it was Zaragoza's plan for them to enrich themselves and live in comfort and luxury. Accordingly, one evening the two friends, with pickaxe, a hoe, and a shovel, directed their way towards the palace. They approached the cellar by a small door, and then began to dig in the ground at the floor of the cellar wall. After a few hours of steady work, they succeeded in making an excavation leading into the interior. Zaragoza entered and gathered upon as many bags of money as he and Luis could carry. During the night, they made several trips to the cellar, each time taking back to their house as much money as they could manage. For a long time, the secret was not discovered, and the two friends lost no opportunity of increasing their already great hoard. Zaragoza gave away freely much of his share to the poor, but his friend was selfish and kept constantly admonishing him not to be too liberal. In the time, the king observed that the bulk of his treasure was considerably reduced, and he ordered his soldiers to find out what had caused the disappearance of so much money. Upon close examination, the soldiers discovered the secret passage, and the king, enraged, summoned his counselors to discuss what should be done to punish the thief. In the meantime, the two friends were earnestly discussing whether they should get more bags of money or should refrain from making further thefts. Zaragoza suggested they would better first get in touch with the secret deliberations of the court before making another attempt. Luis, however, as if called by fate, insisted that they should make one more visit to the king's cellar and then inquired about the unrest at the court. Persuaded against better judgment, Zaragoza followed his friend to the palace and saw that their secret passage was in the same condition as they had lately left it. Luis lowered himself into the hole, but lo, the whiz of an arrow was heard, and then a faint cry from Luis. "What is the matter? Are you hurt?" asked Zaragoza. "I am dying. Take care of my son." These were Luis's last words. Zaragoza knew not what to do. He tried to pull up the dead body of his friend, but in vain, for it was firmly caught between the two heavy blocks of wood and was pierced by many arrows. But Zaragoza was shrewd, and fearing the consequences of discovery of Luis's corpse, he cut off the dead man's head and hurried home with it, leaving the body behind. He broke the fatal news to Maria, whose grief was boundless. She asked him why he had mutilated her husband's body, and he satisfied her by telling her that they would be betrayed if Louise were recognized. Taking young Louise in her arms, Maria said, "For the sake of your godson, see that his father's body is properly buried." "Upon my word of honor, I promise to do as you wish," was Zaragoza's reply. Meantime, the king was discussing the theft with his advisors. Finally, wishing to identify the criminal, the king decreed that the body should be carried through the principal streets of the city and neighboring villages, followed by a train of soldiers, who were instructed to arrest any person who should show sympathy for the dead man. Early one morning, the military procession started out and passed through the main streets of the city. When the procession arrived before Zaragoza's house, it happened that Maria was at the window, and seeing the body of her husband, she cried, "Oh, my husband!" Seeing the soldiers entering the house, Zaragoza asked, "What is your pleasure?" "We want to arrest that woman," was the answer of the chief of the guard. "Why? She has not committed any crime." "She is the widow of the dead man." Her words betrayed her, for she exclaimed the dead man was her husband. "Who is her husband?" "That remark was meant for me, because I had unintentionally hurt our young son," said Zaragoza, smiling. The soldiers believed his words and went out on their way. Reaching a public place when it almost night, they decided to stay there until the next morning. Zaragoza saw his opportunity. He disguised himself as a priest and went into the palace, taking with him a bottle of wine mixed with a strong narcotic. When he arrived, he said that he was a priest, and being afraid to have with them, he said that he was a priest and went to the place, taking with him a bottle of wine mixed with strong narcotics. When he arrived, he said that he was a priest, and being afraid of robbers, wished to pass the night with some soldiers. The soldiers were glad to have with them, as they thought, a pious man whose stories would inspire them to do good. After they talked A while, Zaragoza offered his bottle of wine to the soldiers, who freely drank from it. As was expected, they soon all fell asleep, and Zaragoza succeeded in stealing the corpse of Luis. He took it home and buried it in the same place where he had buried the head. The following morning, the soldiers woke up and were surprised to see that the priest and the corpse were gone. The king soon knew how his scheme had failed. Then he thought of another plan. He ordered that a sheep covered with precious metal should be let loose in the streets, and that it should be followed by a spy, whose duty was to watch from a distance, and in case anyone attempt to catch the sheep, to ascertain the house of that person, and then report to the palace. Having received his orders, the spy let loose the sheep and followed it at a distance. Nobody else dared even to make a remark about the animal, but when Zaragoza saw it, he drove it into his yard. The spy, following instructions, marked the door of Zaragoza's house with a cross and hastened him to the palace. The spy assured the soldiers that they would be able to capture the criminal, but when they began to look for the house, they found that all the houses were similarly marked with crosses. For the third time, the king had failed, and given up all hopes of catching the thief, he issued a proclamation pardoning the man who had committed the theft, provided he would present himself to the king within 3 days. Hearing the royal proclamation, Zaragoza went before the king and confessed that he was the perpetrator of the thefts that had caused so much trouble in the court. True to his word, the king did not punish him. Instead, the king promised to give Zaragoza a title of nobility if he could trick Don Juan, the richest merchant in the city. The king promised to give Zaragoza a title of nobility if he could trick Don Juan, the richest merchant in the city, out of his most valuable goods. When he knew of the desire the king, Zaragoza looked for a fool whom he could use as his instrument. He soon found one, whom he managed to teach to say "Sigh," Spanish for yes. Whenever asked a question, they say "Sí." Dressed in the fool in a guise of a bishop, Zaragoza took a carriage and drove to the store of Don Juan. There he began to ask the fool such questions as these. "Does your grace wish to have this? Does not your grace think that this is cheap?" To all which the fool's answer was, "Sí." At last, when the carriage was well loaded, Zaragoza said, "I will first take these things home, and then return with the money for them." To which the fool replied, "Sí." When Zaragoza reached the palace with the rich goods, he was praised by the king for his sagacity. After a while, Don Juan, the merchant, found out that what he thought was a bishop was really a fool. So he went to the king and asked that he be given justice. Moved by pity, the king restored all the goods that had been stolen, and Don Juan wondered how His Majesty had come into possession of his lost property. Once more the king wanted to test Zaragoza's ability. Accordingly, he told him to bring to the palace an old hermit who lived in a cave in the neighboring mountains. At first, Zaragoza tried to persuade Tubal to pay the visit to the king, but in vain. Having failed in his first attempt, Zaragoza determined to play a trick on the old hermit. He secretly placed an iron cage near the mouth of Tubal's cave, and then, in the guise of an angel, he stood on a high cliff and shouted, "Tubal! Tubal! Hear ye me! Tubal!" Tubal, hearing the call, came out of his cave, and seeing what he thought was an angel, knelt down. Then Zaragoza shouted, "I know that you are very religious and have come to reward your piety. The gates of heaven are open, and I will lead you thither. Go enter the cage, and you will see the way to heaven." Tubal meekly obeyed, but when he was in the cage, he did not see the miracle he expected. Instead, he was placed in a carriage and brought before the king. Thoroughly satisfied now, the king released Tubal and fulfilled his promise to Zaragoza. Zaragoza was knighted and placed among the chief advisors of the kingdom. And after he had been raised to this high rank, he called to his side Maria and his godson, and they lived happily under the protection of one of the who became the most upright and generous man of the realm.